A reading from Acts. The baptized devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many signs and wonders were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. The word of the Lord.
So, the resurrection of Jesus created a big problem for the first Christian disciples. Now, usually we celebrate the resurrection and we think about all of the great opportunities and good things that the resurrection meant and that Jesus rising from the dead gave to the disciples. Sin is forgiven. Death is no longer the end. Joy replaces sadness. All of those things are true, and they were true for the first disciples as well. But the resurrection of Jesus also meant that the disciples were now called to continue to follow Jesus into the future. And at first, that probably seemed just fine. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that following Jesus wasn't going to be like it was before. Jesus occasionally appeared to his disciples in bodily form, but not often. And as the story goes on, Jesus makes it clear that not seeing Jesus in bodily form is going to be the new normal. Yet, Jesus still called his disciples to follow him. Jesus promised to be the good shepherd who would guide them forward. Jesus promised to be with them always, even when they couldn't physically see him. But this is the problem. How are they supposed to follow Jesus when they couldn't physically see him in front of them? How are they going to listen to the voice of their shepherd when they couldn't hear him speaking just the way he had before? And how are they supposed to know where to go when Jesus was not physically leading the way in front of them? That was the new problem that the resurrection presented. And it was even worse for people that had never seen Jesus before. How were the new disciples going to come to know Jesus, to hear Jesus, and to follow Jesus into the future? At least as Luke tells the story, the early Christian community in Jerusalem decided that the best way to do this would be to devote themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. It is a short and seemingly normal sentence at the beginning of today's first reading. It is not full of miracles and wonders, and so we may be tempted to pass over it pretty quickly. But this sentence is, I think, one of the keys to understanding how at least one early Christian community listened for the voice of Jesus and followed him into the future. First thing to know about this sentence is that we translate this verb devoted in English as, devoted. And, the believers were devoted to all of these things. And it's not a wrong translation, but when I read the word devoted, often when we listen to this, it sounds like more of a spiritual, pious thing I do in my heart. I am so devoted to this idea or something like that. And that's fine, but the Greek verb really means more than that. It means that you persistently do something. You keep it up. It's an active thing. You never stop in spite of everything else that may be going on in your life. And this means that in spite of everything else that might be going on in the lives of those early believers, they persistently kept up with the apostles' teaching. That is, they never figured they knew all the stuff they needed to know. They kept trying to listen, to learn, and to understand more deeply. And this was because they understood that the apostles, even though they were very clearly fallible people, were people through whom Jesus would speak to them. They could listen to the voice of their shepherd through the apostles' words, and that's why they were devoted to the teaching. Note, it's devoted to the teaching of the apostles. It was not a cult of personality around any individual. They also persistently kept up with fellowship. Jesus called his followers to be his flock. That is, they were part of a community. And so they also realized that following Jesus into the future could not be a private spiritual experience. They had to care for and nurture the community they were part of. And that nurture of the community, which is really what the word fellowship means, was something they had to constantly strengthen with one another. They persistently kept up with the breaking of the bread. Over the centuries, biblical scholars and commentators have debated whether this means persistence in sharing communion or persistence simply in eating together. But it probably means both. As last Sunday's gospel reading reminded us, Jesus revealed himself and his presence through meals. And those early believers realized that persistence in doing that, in eating together, was one of the ways that they opened themselves up to the presence of Jesus, even when they couldn't physically see him standing in front of them. And they persistently kept up with the prayers. And this may seem hard to understand because Luke doesn't tell us, prayers for what? Or prayers in what way? But prayer isn't first and foremost a heavenly petition for God to do something which, if we do it in the right way or gather enough signatures, then God will do what we tell him to do. Instead, prayer is first and foremost about opening yourself up to listen to what God has to say to you. It's about entering into relationship with God and, by extension, being in relationship with those for whom you pray. And the early believers seem to have known that if they were going to listen for the voice of their shepherd and to follow him into the future, it would mean constantly and persistently listening for the guidance of God in that kind of prayer. Persistence in all of those things was how the early Christian community managed to follow Jesus in spite of the stress and the conflict that surrounded them. In today's first reading, it sounds like they didn't have any of those problems. As the story ends, Luke acts like, and they all got along great, and everybody spoke well of them. Luke was supposed to be a doctor. We don't know if this was even written by Luke, but Luke was a physician. We don't know that he was a doctor, but he was clearly the earliest church spin doctor, because he always tried to put the best possible interpretation on how everything was hunky-dory, but it clearly was not. The next few stories that Luke tells us about in Acts involve some of the apostles getting arrested and beaten up by the temple authorities. Internal divisions within the early Christian community over stuff like giving, and even the first martyrdom for being a witness to Jesus. All was not sweetness and light. But that community survived, and in spite of it all, they were able to actually grow because they were persistent in doing these basic but vital things. As we celebrate all the good things about the resurrection each year on these 7 weeks of Easter, we also have the same problem, though, as those first disciples. We don't see Jesus physically standing in front of us or talking to us as we speak to the same way that we talk to one another. And yet, Jesus is also with us, guiding us, leading us into the future. And so for us to be able to see, hear, and experience the risen Jesus in our lives, it's also often the case that it's helpful to be persistent in doing these same things that the early Christians in Jerusalem did. That is, we're more likely to actually experience the presence and the guidance of our Good Shepherd when we're persistent in listening to the apostles' teaching. And sometimes that simply means being willing persistently to dig more deeply into biblical stories that we have listened to, or at least many of us have listened to and heard for years, and not simply saying, hey, I remember that story once when I was in Sunday school. I learned the kiddie version. And it's not that the kiddie version was wrong, but there is so much more than just that. That's one of the reasons that when we do Vacation Bible School this year, we're going to do adult class. And adult class is always taking a look at the same stories and going, you probably know what we taught the kids in Sunday school, and that's true, but there's deeper stuff here, and we're going to try to explore that together. Persistently doing those kinds of things is one of the ways we listen for Jesus. For us, too, maintaining this relationship with Jesus, our Good Shepherd, is about persistence in fellowship. It's being part of Jesus' flock all the time. And simply being together, even if it's for a fun event like Cinco de Mayo this week, binds us together so that we can support and care for one another when it is not party time. And that seems to be what happened with the early Christian community in Jerusalem. They were persistent in their fellowship, and so when bad times happened, they were able to support each other, to strengthen each other, and to survive together because they had that connection to each other. For us too, being persistent in the breaking of the bread is part of the way that we too follow Jesus, both in fellowship and at the communion table. We were talking about, as we concluded confirmation class last week, we were talking about the real presence of Jesus in the bread and the wine and what that means. And for all the other things that it means that Jesus, through this meal, is making himself real in our lives so that we can make Jesus real in the lives of others. If you are not somehow connected to the real presence of Jesus in your life, you can't possibly be an agent of the real presence of Jesus in somebody else's life. Part of what the early Christian community discovered was that Jesus revealed himself through these meals. And it was in those meals they really experienced Jesus' presence and could share that with others. And that's part of what helped them to continue to move forward into the future as Jesus' flock. And for us too. Persistence in prayer is an important thing. And that often scares so many people. All you got to do to make people be quiet, like, here's how I could make everybody be quiet at the Cinco de Mayo party. I would say, before we start, we're going to say grace. Somebody volunteer to say grace. All the Lutherans get quiet. It's like, because I don't know what the words are, and I don't know what the right way from the manner, and blah, blah, blah. They don't feel like they have the right words or know what to say. But prayer is not fundamentally about talking, but about opening yourself up to God. It's about lifting up others, even and especially when you don't have the answer to what they need. And sometimes it's as simple as what Paul says when he reminds us in Romans that the Spirit intercedes with us for sighs too deep for words. It's simply about going, I don't know, God, now what? And then listening for the answer. You know, many years ago when I was having back problems, the doctor gave me this booklet of basic exercises. He said, you know, you're supposed to do these things. And as I read the little booklet, it's very short, not lots of them, the booklet informed me that none of these exercises was particularly new or hard to do. For 150 years, they've been telling people to do these exercises. But it also said that doing them regularly was what would make the difference. Doing them occasionally, it said, is unlikely to help. And this is the point Luke is making about persistently doing these things. The prayers, the breaking of the bread, the fellowship, the listening to the apostles' teaching. It's in the persistence of doing these things, like listening to God's word and nurturing fellowship with one another, sharing in the meal and the prayers, that Jesus continues to guide us and help us. It's through the persistence in these things that we more deeply experience Jesus' presence in our lives. And it's through persistence in doing all of them that we become agents of Jesus' risen life in the lives of other people that we come into contact with.